Chapter 1. Introductory Outline of Study. After the lapse of 800 years, the story of the Crusades still furnishes the most fascinating, if not the most instructive, pages of Christian history. Bite told, romance has entertained the generations from the days of the Italian Tasso to those of Walter Scott, with the rude, yet chivalric characters of those medieval times, ponderous knights and dashing emirs, fair women and saintly apparitions, continue to move over the mimic stage of the imagination. Poetry, in all the tongues of modern Europe, draws its imagery from scenes that were enacted while these languages were being formed from their classic or barbaric originals. The hymnology of the Church is enriched by the songs of those who caught their rhythm from the march of the crusading host. Bernard of Cluny watched the Salvation armies of the olden time as they sauntered by his cloister window, now catching their spirit and anon oppressed with their failure to express the truest prowess of the believer's soul. He tried to lift men's faith to the Jerusalem above. O happy band of pilgrims, if onward ye will tread with Jesus, as your fellow to Jesus as your head. Thou hast no shore, fair ocean, thou hast no time, bright day, dear fountain of refreshment to pilgrims on the way. Upon the rock of ages they raise thy holy tower. Thine is the victor's laurel, and thine the golden dower. Our newest songs catch the very gleam of those battle days. For example, onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before, is not unlike the chorus of a Latin hymn of Berthia of Orleans, which was sung under the tent and on the field. Dignum crucis, signum ducis equitur, quod non cessit, sed facet, resuscit invixanti spiritus. The student of human nature, also, will find here his most subtle and perplexing, but at the same time his most suggestive subjects. Never before or since was there such exalted faith combined with such grotesque superstition, such splendid self-sacrifice, mingled with cruel and unrestrained selfishness, such holy purpose with its wings entangled, torn, and besmeared in vicious environments. To the historical scholar, this period is unsurpassed in importance by any, if we accept the days of the birth of Christianity. The age of the Crusades covers the 11th and 12th centuries for 200 years. To use the vigorous language of the Greek Princess Anna Komnena, who witnessed the first crusade, Europe was loosened from its foundations and hurled against Asia. As an alpine glacier presses down into the valley, only to melt away at the summer line, yet with renewed snows, repeals the fatal experiment from year to year. So 7 times Western Christendom replenished its mighty armaments, to see them destroyed at the borderland of Oriental conquest. To define the causes of these vast movements is a task which both tempts and tantalizes the historian. It is surely unlearned to ascribe even the first crusade to the sole influence of any man, though he were an urban Sioux, and wielded the temporal and spiritual authority of the papacy in its most puissant days. It is puerile to say, as Michel does, speaking of Peter the Hermit, the glory of delivering Jerusalem belongs to a single pilgrim, possessed of no other power than the influence of his character and genius. It is equally uncritical, if not blasphemous, to attribute these most unfortunate and ill-timed ventures to the Almighty, as the same writer does in these words. No power on earth could have produced such a great revolution. It only belonged to him whose will gives birth to and disperses tempests, to throw all at once into human hearts that enthusiasm which silenced all other passions and drew on the multitude as if by an invisible power. To even approximate an understanding of this subject, one must first become familiar with the great racial movements which culminated in that age, must be able to estimate the tendencies of society at a time when it knew not the forces which were struggling within itself, must penetrate the policies of statesmen and ecclesiastics who veiled their ambition under the self-delusion that they were serving God or their fellow men. And besides all this, he must gauge the passions and habits of common people, their ignorance and superstition, if not the true heavenly ardor, which led them to offer themselves as fuel for the most stupendous human sacrifice the world has known. Were one thus equipped with information, one's philosophical judgment might still be baffled with the inquiry, what was the chief cause of the Crusades? An observation of Dean Milman is especially applicable to this subject. When all the motives which stir the human mind and heart, the most impulsive passion and the profoundest policy, conspire together, it is impossible to discover which is the dominant influence in guiding to a certain course of action. The mighty tide of events we are to consider was not unlike a vast river which sweeps through many lands and has many tributary streams, some of whose sources are hidden in the depth of the unexplored wilderness. Our preliminary study will therefore be wisely limited to an inquiry into the conditions of life and thought in the 11th century, which facilitated or prompted the great movement. These conditions were prominently the intellectual and moral state of society in the 11th century, especially its rudeness and warlike spirit, the institution of chivalry, the awakening of better ideals of heroism, the feudal system which provided for the easy mobilization of men in war or adventure, the impoverished condition of Europe, which forced enterprise to seek its reward in foreign countries, the papal policy to consolidate and universalize the ecclesiastical empire, the menace of Mohammedanism under the Saracenic and Turkish powers, the prevailing superstition which credited to pilgrimage the virtues of piety, and substituted exploits in the Holy Land for the plainer duties of holy life. Chapter 2. State of society, ignorance, dullness of life superstition, low sense of justice, cruelty, taste for war. Cardinal Baronius, the historian of the Church down to the year of Untondi 8, designated the period which then closed as the Dark Ages. The propriety of the title has ensured its perpetuity. The era of the Crusades is almost evenly divided by the date which all scholars, following Baronius, regard as marking the end of the worst and the beginning of better times. The 11th and 12th centuries were the battleground on which the grim spectres of the old met the bright, advancing spirits of the new civilization. It must be remembered that the peoples then dominant were the descendants of those barbaric hordes whose eruption from northern Europe and western Asia had swept away the Roman Empire. The fierce spirit of the Frank in Gaul, of the Goth in Spain, and of the Lombard in Italy was not yet tempered by the arts and philosophy their fathers had so nearly destroyed, and whose renaissance had not yet begun. It was but a few generations since the people that had inherited the Roman civilization had been largely exterminated. So complete had been the ravage that in the 8th century much of the land in Italy still remained forest and marsh, a condition to which it had reverted. Parcels of ground were purchased by strangers as eremi, the title secured by the fact of having cleared and cultivated any given spot, the reader can readily paint his own picture of the society which settled these lands by recalling such facts as that from 900 to 930 Italy was under the Huns. In 911 Normandy was conquered by Rollo the Dane. In 1029 the Normans possessed themselves of the south of Italy. Culture, however, was not entirely extinct. The age produced many fine specimens of what is best in manhood and womanhood, although in comparison with the general condition, these were like sporadic bushes on the breast of a landslide, whose roots have maintained their hold through the rushing debris, or which have sprung up afresh in the new soil. There were some men whose genius and virtues would have adorned any age. Among these was Gerbert, Pope Sylvester II, whose attainments in science led to the legend that he was in communication with the devil. Lanfranc, 1089, the monk of Bec and Caen, whom William the Conqueror appointed to the See of Canterbury, is still renowned for his great logical ability and biblical scholarship. Anselm, 10-320, Tenement 9, merited the praise which Dante bestowed upon him as among the worthiest spirits he saw in paradise. Berenger, 998, though discredited for heresy, possessed a prowess and independence of mind which made him the forerunner of the later reformers. Hildebrand, 1085. However we may reprobate the hardness of his ambition and the tyrannical nature of his projects, must be recognized as among the greatest of mankind for astuteness of judgment and ability to execute the most gigantic and hazardous plans. Abelard, 1079-1142, was a lad of 16 at the time of the First Crusade, but had begun to puzzle his teacher, William of Champeaux, in his dialectical tilts, deriding the obsolete method of inquiry, and declaring that it was more sport to debate than to fight in a tournament. Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090-153, whose pen was to control Christendom for a generation, and whose sainthood shines through all ages, was in the nursery when the soldiers of the cross started for the East. There were noble women, too. Bernard owed much of his talent and virtue to his mother, Aletta, whose memory is the imperishable ornament of womanhood. The great Countess Matilda spoke many languages, was chosen counsellor of Pope Gregory VII, and won her place in Dante's catalogue of saints as the celestial messenger heralding the chariot throne of the glorified Beatrice. The praise of the great crusading Captain Godfrey Hallos, his mother, Ida of Bouillon, to whom he confessed that, next to the grace of God, he owed whatever goodness made him beloved of men. The intellectuality of this period exercised itself almost entirely with theological and religious subjects. Men in seclusion elaborated and defended existing church doctrines, and gave pious flight to their imaginations, but of literature as such there was none. Even the troubadours had not begun to rhyme the Provençal tongue. The hot breath of the Crusades themselves forced the debris of the Latin to send out its first flowers of poesy. In this age, at least, may be discerned the budding of a taste and sentiment that betokened the refinement of after times. Gothic architecture, the first efflorescence of the northern genius after it had been planted in the soil of southern art, now appeared in such buildings as the cathedrals of Pisa, Modena, Parma, Siena, St. Petersburg, Treves, Worms, Mayence, Basel, Chartres, Brussels, and the foundation of St. Mark's in Venice. The dreaded year 1000 having safely passed, without the anticipated destruction of the world, faith re-inspired art to build temples on earth. New monasteries appeared, palatial in structure, to accommodate the people who sought in seclusion escape from the hardness or the dreariness of life in the world. It must, however, be recognized that whatever brilliancy of intelligence, beauty, of character or enterprise appeared, betokened a coming rather than illustrated a passing age, like the wild flowers that shoot from the cold ground in the early spring. To picture these brighter things, were the genial task pursued to any great extent, would endanger the accuracy of the impression made upon the reader's mind. Hallam truly says of this period, history, which reflects only the more prominent features of society, cannot exhibit the virtues that were scarcely able to struggle through the general deprivation. This was an age of gross ignorance. The art of making paper from cotton had just been discovered, and, while it contributed somewhat to the diffusion of knowledge by giving cheaper manuscript books than those on vellum, the world was to wait 4 centuries longer for the printing press to popularize the habit of seeking information. The few manuscripts which existed were the property of monasteries or of the nobility, who kept them as articles of furniture rather than for their practical use. We have a verbal monument to the ignorance of these times in the expression we still use when we speak of signing or making a mark to signify one's name. In the 9th century, Albo, the supreme judge of the empire, could not write his name, and as late as the 14th century, Du Guesclin, High Constable of France, was equally innocent of letters. One of their contemporaries gives this tribute to the ecclesiastics of the time. They were given rather to the gullet than to the tongue. Guli quam glossae. They preferred to be schooled in Salmon rather than in Solomon. Salmoni quam Solomon. Few priests could translate the breviary they recited with parrot tongues. Of the history of the grand civilization just behind them, the people knew nothing. Even the laws which had so long preserved the state and society, those of Justinian, were forgotten, except in some cloisters, where they were studied as classic law, the practical methods of modern inquiry into the meaning of the world, the incessant discovery of new resources in nature for the comfort and luxury of living, have stimulated and enlarged the human mind, and in the new interests thus created men have found a healthful diversion alike from the engrossments of animalism and the morbid fancies of superstition. But in the time we are studying, there was no real scientific thought that was not instantly suppressed by the authorities of the Church as the suggestion of heretics or of the Saracens. Roger Bacon, who flourished so late as the close of the Crusades, paid 14 years' imprisonment for his temerity in proposing the more rational methods of viewing the world, which his great namesake, Francis Bacon, 350 years later, more completely formulated for general acceptance. The industrial arts had been lost, or had come to be entirely neglected, after the barbaric conquest which swept away the Roman civilization, and during the centuries since there had been scarcely any attempt to revive them. The very faculty of invention seems to have become paralyzed by disuse. It was not until 1148 that Roger of Sicily established a silk factory at Palermo, which, Hallam says, gave the earliest impulse to the industry of Italy. Such times were necessarily marked by the narrow limitation and degradation of common life. The vast majority of people lived in the country, in complete isolation from their fellows, seeking sustenance in most primitive ways from the breast of Mother Nature, or they were huddled together in rude hamlets under the walls of the castles, whose lords enslaved while they protected them. For such was the chaotic condition of society that everyone was compelled to seek safety with service under some possessor of a stronghold. Cities there were, crowded with dense masses of humanity, the breeding places of all sorts of vice and social disorder. Towns owe their existence to some community of interest, such as similar industrial pursuits or convenience for trade. These, of course, had scarcely begun to spring up, if the immediate environment of the common man furnished no stimulus to enterprise, neither was it provided by anything beyond his neighborhood. Without a system of monetary exchange, trade was limited to barter or to the purchasing power a person belt. A brief journey with merchandise was executed with hazard. Every petty lord exacted toll of those who passed the border of his estate. Many of the occupants of the castles lived by open robbery, and kept men-at-arms as they kept their falcons, to pounce upon their prey. Not only the goods, the persons also of travellers were regarded as legitimate booty, the victims being held for ransom and often sold as slaves. So enterprising were these robber knights that it is said to have been dangerous for the king to go from Paris to Saint-Denis without an army at his back. The armed merchantman rode generally with lance in rest. In towns, says Thierry, nobles, sword in hand, committed robbery on the burghers, and in turn the burghers committed violence upon the peasants who came to buy or sell at the market of the town. There was considerable foreign commerce on the Mediterranean. The merchants of Pisa, Genoa, and Venice were in rivalry with those of Byzantium, and with the Saracens who held the ports of Spain and North Africa. But, as what are known as maritime laws were not agreed upon until the 13th century, commerce was little more than piracy. The trade vessels were burdened with men for their defence, or for rifling the cargoes of less puissant marauders. The mariner's compass had been invented, but was not in common use, so that trade was compelled to follow the coastlines, in perpetual hazard of wreck and robbers. There was no importation of things for common use. The labour and danger of transportation limited the articles of trade to those of rarest value, which became the spoil of the powerful or the purchase of the rich. The ordinary man received no benefit from other neighbourhoods than his own, except that the air of heaven was sweetened by its passage over the mountains and seas which separated him from his kind. It is difficult for us to realize what must have been the inane stupidity of the ordinary lives of men. Homes were almost as dreary in their outward appointments as the nests of eagles or the caves of beasts. In the city were narrow apartments of stone, or the shanty, with its mud-built walls, often as contracted as the cells of the monastery, and as damp and fetid as the vaults of the prison, so that the monk lost little of this world's comfort in entering his religious retreat, and the prisoner might think himself happy at times in being better housed than he would have been had he made his home with honest toil. If one lived in the country, the habitation was a hut, but little better than the shelter provided for cattle. Indeed, in many cases the ox knew his own from having slept on the same straw, and the ass his master's cry from its proximity to the family table. The floor of the rude domicile was of earth or stone, the windows unglazed, so that to exclude the winter weather was to shut out the light also. A hole in the roof scarcely sufficed to carry off the smoke from the stoveless fires. No books entertained man's thoughts, no pictures pleased his eye. His news was the gossip of oft-told tales, his faith such as a priest, himself unable to read, might impose upon his less intelligent parishioners. Even the peasant's liberty of his own solitude was denied him. He could not range the woods nor float upon the streams at his pleasure. We are told of certain instances where the rustics rebelled against these restrictions imposed upon them. They took short cuts through the woods, or used the fords and rivers at will, but they were punished by the knights, who cut off the hands and feet of the trespassers. If the rich were better conditioned, their residences were unfurnished with that which the middle classes in our day regard as necessary to comfort and decency. The bounty of the table was without variety. Apparel, however gay, was such as could be wrought by the women of the household. The tapestries which excite our admiration were the product of untold toil, or purchased at vast expense. Within the castle was spacious monotony, relieved too generally by the grossness of private debauch. Without was the wilderness, threaded by roads that were unfit for wheeled vehicles, menaced by wild beasts and more dangerous men. The common recreation of the lordly classes was hunting and hawking, bear-baiting and fighting. Men rode with sword and spear, the ubiquitous falcon on arm, and hounds in leash. So universal were such pastimes that, in lack of more intellectual and refined resources, the highest dignitaries of the Church displayed the weapons of the chase together with the insignia of their sacred office. So much of life was wasted in these amusements that the Council of the Lateran in Asati forbade the bishops indulging in these sports while on their pastoral journeys. Previously, Pope Alexander III, 1959-64, by special edict, relieved the common clergy from the necessity of keeping the archdeacons in hounds and falcons during their visits to the churches. Such a limitation of the more generous and worthy interests of mankind, which stimulate and enlarge the mind, left the common intelligence in an almost infantile condition. Sismondi says that even the nobles came to count it a duty not to think. One can readily believe this on recalling the titles given at court to the various royal personages who graced it: Pepin the Short, Charles the Bold, William the Red, Louis the Fat, etc. Fancy, however, will generally survive the failure of the logical and aesthetic faculties, and thus men become the easy prey of superstition. All sorts of stories of things supernatural, the invention of designing priests all born of the surprise of ignorance at the unusual in nature, were believed without question. The winds that rustled the leaves of the forest were supposed to be the voices of saintly ghosts, and when with wintry weight they moaned through the branches or screeched along the icy rocks, it was believed that the damned were groaning in their pains, or that demons were threatening men. Every flash or shadow that could not readily be explained was regarded as a hopeful or vengeful apparition from the unseen world. This credulity was not confined to the illiterate and boorish. The chroniclers of that age, upon whose learning we depend for the facts of our history, relate with equal gravity the deeds of demons and men, connect the doings of courts and the course of comets, and intermingle in relation of cause and effect the storms of nature and the wars of nations. Thus superstition completed the work of mental inoccupancy, as vermin and bats inhabit an unfurnished cell. Such a condition of the mental faculties could have only a deleterious influence on the moral sense. We are not, therefore, surprised to find the conscience of the age correspondingly crude. This ethical degradation was reflected in the low state of the laws. If the changeable wills or whims of a host of petty lords can be dignified with the title of legislation, power claimed possession with little regard for the method of acquisition. Disputes, when relegated to the pretense of a court, were tried not by weighing evidence, but by counting the number of compurgators, that is, of those persons who would swear that they believed the oath of one or the other party. When the contestants were gentlemen or of the noble order, the cases were arbitrated on the field of private combat. Even the judge or referee of the combat was himself liable to challenge from either party that felt itself aggrieved by his decision. Priests, invalids, and women were accustomed to choose someone from among their relatives or friends to champion their cause. There was no appeal to candid judgment after a full hearing of the facts, except in case of dispute between slaves, villains, and freemen of inferior condition, whose owners or lords might be disposed to fair dealing. A relic of the medieval custom of private combat is the modern duel. The personal encounter often grew to the dimensions of neighborhood war, in which kinsmen and retainers were involved until entire districts were laid waste. Neither the power of Charlemagne nor that of the Church prevailed against this unreasonable custom. The one exception to this statement was the temporary lull in the carnage during what was known as the Truce of God, an expedient agreed upon in certain places, according to which raids and riots were confined to the half of the week succeeding the Sabbath. But the adoption of this merciful rule forces our attention to its necessity, since man's inhumanity to mar was destroying entire populations, as in a deluge of blood. When for any reason the combat was inexpedient, the question of right was decided by the ordeal. The accused party presumed to walk through fire, or on burning plowshares, to handle hot iron, float upon water, plunge the bare arm into a boiling cauldron, or swallow a bit of consecrated bread with appeal to heaven to strike one dead, if guilty. If one endured the ordeal unscathed, he was said to be acquitted by the judgment of God. It is not necessary to explain the apparent impunity with which some of the worst criminals passed these trials, nor to cite the multitude of cases in which persons of otherwise undoubted innocence were judged guilty, because they perished in this irrelevant attempt to vindicate themselves. The fact that questions involving the most sacred rights of the individual, such as the holding of property, the protection of the body from mutilation on the rack, the retaining of life, and the vindication of character, were not so much as brought to the court of intelligence and conscience, argues the degradation of both these faculties. If further evidence be needed that the very sense of justice had become largely extinguished, it is found in the prevalence of judicial perjury, allowed and even prompted by legalized custom. Before the combat both parties were required to partake of the sacrament, in which act one of the contestants, being guilty, was forced to commit sacrilege. Witnesses were sworn upon the relics of the saints, but, notwithstanding these things, were believed to have in them a limitless power to help or hurt those who touched their sacred encasements. The people seem to have credited the righteousness of the dead as little as the impartiality of the living, and the guilty were accustomed to perjure themselves without dread of consequences. The soul of good Robert of France was so afflicted by the universal consciencelessness in this respect that he devised an expedient for averting the wrath of the saints, who might justly avenge the slight put upon their bones. He ordered that the relics should be secretly removed from the casket that was supposed to contain them, though that the would-be perjurer might not actually commit the crime he intended. If this act illustrated the mercy, it also displayed the lack of true moral sentiment in him who, in contrast with his fellows, was known as the good king. Such stifling of the sense of justice was quite naturally attended by the suppression of the gentler emotions of kindness and humanity. This was an age of almost incredible cruelty. Natural affection, of course, survived in the love of parents and children, husbands and wives. There were delightful friendships which illumined the social gloom like threads of gold in some dark fabric. Men and women lived and died for one another, as they will always do, while a lineament of the divine remains in the human. But beyond the fascination of the individual and the obligations of kinship, the sentiment of love seemed unknown to the masses. The founders of the great benevolent orders, men like Dominic and Francis of Assisi, oppressed by this deadness to the essential Christian spirit, were in the near future to unbind the hearts of men that they might come forth to more generous life. But that day had not yet come. Men apparently had lost the sympathetic imagination by which the pains and grief of the unfortunate are transferred to the hearts of others. Dean Sandley remarks of even the 13th century that the age had no sense of obligation to the poor and middle class. It was still needful that rulers should repeat the dying counsel of Charlemagne to his sons, not to deprive widows and orphans of their remaining estates. This insensibility to the needs of others was accompanied by a positive gratification in scenes of cruelty. The popular stories which mothers taught their children were in praise of heroes, whom we would regard as butchers and bruisers. A favourite legend was of Renaud, the flower of early chivalry, he of the ugly visage and gigantic frame, whose mace laid open the brains of his antagonists, and who broke the skull of the monk who refused to indulge his whim of exchanging clothes with him. What child of that age had not heard of Roland, the hero of Roncesvalles, whose unstinted praises went far to form the manly habits of many generations? He was an infant terrible, who tore his swaddling clothes in pieces, belabored his mother furiously, and gave early promise of his prowess by beating lifeless the porter of the castle, who would not let him go out to play. And how charming Roland's love-making to the fair Aude! He saw her for the first time amid the galaxy of beauties assembled to witness his combat with Oliver. Unable to restrain his passion, he rushed from the lists, threw himself upon her, and would have carried her off bodily, had not Oliver given him one of those blows, the echo of which has rung the praises of this medieval prize-fighter down the ages. But the people of the 11th century did not need to go back to an earlier era for examples of this sort of manliness. Fawkes the Black, the greatest of the Counts of Anjou, 987-1040, was pious enough to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but not sufficiently humane to refrain from burning his young wife at the stake, decked for her doom in her gayest attire. He was so humble that he paraded the streets of the holy city with a halter about his neck, while the blood streamed from the scourge wounds on his shoulders. Yet he forced his own son to be bridled and saddled like an ass, and to crouch on all fours at his feet. Of the whole line of Anjou at this period, the historian Green remarks that their shameless wickedness degraded them below the level of man. The House of Normandy contested the palm of greatness with the Angevins, but were equally rude when William of Normandy, afterwards the conqueror of England, learned that Baldwin of Flanders had refused him his daughter Matilda in marriage. The chronicle says he forced his way into the countess's chamber, found the daughter, took her by her tresses, dragged her about the room, and trampled her under his feet. The young lady does not seem to have been grieved by the violence of the wooing, but rather to have acquired a better appreciation of the lordly qualities of her future husband. We may be permitted to doubt the accuracy of this story, but the fact that it was so early chronicled and generally believed attests the popular taste. William Rufus, 1056 Sophantausend, is thus described by one who knew him: the outrager of humanity, of law, and of nature, beastly in his pleasures, a murderer and blasphemous scoffer. Henry of England, 168 to 125, put out the eyes of his brother Robert and of his 2 grandchildren, and forced his daughter to cross a frozen fosse, stripped half naked. The penalties under law also revealed the hardness of men's hearts. Criminals were hung by their feet, by their necks, or by their thumbs, with burning matter fastened upon some part of the body. They were put into dungeons with snakes, and into cages too small to allow the full motion of the limbs. They were made to wear wooden or iron collars of enormous weight, so arranged that the culprit could take no position without feeling the burden. In battle, the soldier was to despise the bow, his delight to face the enemy at point of sword, his glory the blood that bespattered him from the gurgling arteries of the foe, or that trickled from his own wounds. No Fabian policy gave éclat to the warrior. Victory was measured by the heaps of the slain, not by the progress of the cause. No quarter was ordinarily given or expected on the capture of strongholds, and not infrequently the entire surviving population of conquered cities paid with their lives the penalty for having permitted themselves to be defended by the vanquished. Raymond of Toulouse we shall learn to admire as our story advances. He was one of the most self-restrained and chivalric of the early crusaders, yet he put out the eyes and cut off the noses of his captives, and sent them thus mutilated to their homes, as a warning to their neighbours not to molest the march of the soldiers of the cross. Of this act of atrocity the chronicler of the day remarks, "It is not easy to do justice to the brave and wisdom conspicuously displayed by the Count here. Too commonly the innocence of childhood, the venerableness of age, and the sacredness of sex were indiscriminately outraged by the license of conquest. The love of war for its own sake was the dominant passion of such people. When no plausible pretext could be urged for declaration of hostilities, it burst out between neighbourhoods as by spontaneous combustion. Raids and counter-raids took the place of the commercial rivalries of later times. From the days of Charlemagne, it had been the custom to signalize entrance upon manhood by buckling about the loins the sword, the investment with virile arms. Church, in hopeless inability to check the universal passion for fight, sought only to direct it to the suppression of ecclesiastical enemies. Pope Paschal, 1099, exhorted Count Robert of Flanders to persecute to the utmost the Emperor Henry, saying, "By such battles you shall obtain a place in the heavenly Jerusalem." Bernard, without dispute the holiest man of the next century, offered no excuse or palliation for his harangue to the faithful. Let them kill the enemy or die. To submit to die for Christ, or to cause one of his enemies to die, is naught but glory. Very characteristic is the story of the death of the youthful Vivian, as told in the famous Chansons de Geste, composed about this time, though its alleged events belong to an earlier date. Vivian was the nephew of that William of Orange, whose name is associated with the rise of knighthood, as that of the later William of Orange is with a nobler patriotism. There had been a fearful fight. Vivian was mortally wounded, and lay dying ere he had partaken of his first sacrament. The older warrior bent over him on the corpse-strewn field. "You must confess to me, because I am your nearest relative, and there is no priest here." The failing lips of the lad began the confession of the sins of his brief lifetime. He could think of but a single offence against God or his own nature. So heinous was his conception of the greatness of this one crime, that it blotted out the memory of all else. What was this monstrous iniquity? He made a vow that I would never retreat one step before an enemy, and this day I have failed to keep my oath. William raised the head of the dying boy, placed the consecrated wafer, which he was accustomed to carry for such emergencies, between the eager lips of Vivian, and watched the young soul as, without fear or misgiving, it went to the judgment of him who is preeminently the god of battles. In the wars of this period, a common sight was that of bishops and archbishops, clad in coats of mail, riding through the streets of their episcopal towns on fierce chargers, and returning to their palaces clotted with dirt and blood. That was a deserved rebuke, as well as a fine sarcasm, with which Richard Coeur de Lion sent the blood-stained armour of the Bishop of Beauvais to the Pope, as the garment of Joseph to Jacob, asking the Holy Father if he recognized his son's coat. Even women on occasion put on armour and mingled in the mêlée. Gaeta, the wife of Robert Guiscard, fought in the front rank of the Normans in their conflict with the Greeks. When the Crusades were in progress, many a fair woman adopted the martial costume. The Amazonian Brunhilde is scarcely overdrawn by Scott in Count Robert of Paris, and the Moslem heroines of Tassos, Jerusalem, delivered, stripped of their supernatural resources, might have figured in the Christian camp. Walter Scott put into the mouth of the Greek Nicephorus a pertinent description of his fellow Christians of the West, to whom the strife of combat is as the breath of their nostrils, who, rather than not be engaged in war, will do battle with their nearest neighbours and challenge each other to mortal fight, as much in sport as we would defy a comrade to a chariot race. It is but just to say that, if the Greeks were amazed at the warlike propensities of the Catholics, they expressed no wonder at their cruelty. In this, they themselves even excelled their more robust rivals. The dungeons of Constantinople were filled with political offenders whose eyes were torn from their sockets, and more than one imperial candidate resumed his place of honour among a people whose waving banners he was unable to see. The Greek differed from the Frank and German, the Norman and Saxon, chiefly in being a coward and choosing to glut his brutal instincts with the use of the secret torture, the poisoned cup, or the dagger in the back of his victim, rather than with the sword and battle-axe in open fight. To a people such as we have described, the appeal for the Crusades, in which the imagined cause of heaven marched in step with their own tastes and habits, was irresistible. Chapter 3. Chivalry, Rules, Education of Knight, Ceremonies, Influence on Character. The call for the Crusades, while appealing powerfully to the warlike disposition of the people, would not have succeeded in rousing Europe had there not been in the popular heart, at least, the germs of nobler sentiment, the vitality of conscience, notwithstanding its degradation, and an inclination towards the exercise of the finer graces of conduct, in spite of the prevalent grossness, manifested themselves in the rise of chivalry, the picturesqueness of knight-errantry, and the glamour thrown over the subject by poetry and romance, may mislead us as to the real character of this institution. We must distinguish between the ideals of knighthood and the actual lives of those who, from various motives, thronged the profession. We must not confound the chivalry of these earlier and ruder ages with that of its more refined, though somewhat effeminate, later days. It would be an equal mistake to pose the half-savage Saxon for a picture of the gallant Provençal, because they were fellows of the same order, but making all allowance for variations, defects and perversions in chivalry, the institution went far towards redeeming the character of the Middle Ages. Among the articles of the chivalric code were the following: to fight for the faith of Christ. In illustration of this part of his vow, the knight always stood with bared head and unsheathed sword during the reading of the lesson from the Gospels in the church service, to serve faithfully prince and fatherland, to defend the weak, especially widows, orphans, and damsels, to do nothing for greed, but everything for glory, to keep one's word, even returning to prison or death, if, having been captured in fair fight, one had promised to do so. Together with these vows of real virtue were others, which signified more for the carnal pride of the warrior, e.g., never to fight in companies against one opponent, to wear but one sword, unless the enemy displayed more than one, not to put off armor while upon an adventure, except for a night's rest, never to turn out of a straight road in order to avoid danger from man, beast, or monster, never to decline a challenge to equal combat, unless compelled to do so by wounds, sickness, or other equally reasonable hindrance. The aspirant for knighthood began his career in early boyhood by attending some superior as his page. Lads of noblest families sought to be attached to the persons of those renowned in the order, though not to their own fathers, lest their discipline should be over-indulgent. Frequently knights of special note for valor and skill at arms opened schools for the training of youth. The page was expected to wait upon his lord as a body servant in the bedchamber, the dining hall, and, when consistent with his tender years, upon the journey and in the camp. It was a maxim of the code that one should learn to obey before attempting to govern. With the development of manly strength, at about his 14th year the page became an esquire. He then burnished and repaired the armor of his chief, broke his steeds, led his charger, and carried his shield to the field of battle. In the melee, he fought by his master's side, nursed him when wounded, and valued his own life as naught when weighed against his lord's safety or honor. The faithful esquire was dubbed a knight at the will and by the hand of his superior. This honor was sometimes awarded on the field of conflict for a specially valiant deed. More commonly, the heroic subalterns were summoned to receive the coveted prize when the fight was done. More than one instance is mentioned where the esquire bowed his head beneath the dead hand of his master, and there assumed the duty of completing the enterprise in which his chief had fallen. Ordinarily, however, the ceremony was held in the castle hall, or in later times in the church, on the occasion of some festival, or upon the candidate's reaching the year of his majority. The rite of admission to knighthood was made as impressive as possible. The young man, having come from the bath, was clothed in a white tunic, expressive of the purity of his purpose. Then in a red robe, symbolical of the blood he was ready to shed, and in a black coat to remind him of the death that might speedily be his portion. After fasting, the candidate spent the night in prayer. In the morning the priest administered to him the Holy Communion, and blessed the sword which hung from his neck. Attendant knights and ladies then clothed him in his armor. Kneeling at the feet of the Lord, he received from him the accolade, 3 blows with the flat of the sword upon his shoulder, with the repetition of the formula, "In the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George, I make thee a knight." More impressive, because more unusual, was the ceremony of his degradation. If he broke his plighted faith or forfeited his honor, he was exposed on a platform, stripped of his armor, which was broken to pieces and thrown upon a dunghill. His shield was dragged in the dirt by a cart-horse. His own charger's tail was cut off, while he was himself carried into a church on a litter, and forced to listen to the burial service, since he was now to move among men as one who was dead to the honor for which he had vowed to live. The chief defect of chivalry was that, while it displayed some of the finer sentiments of the soul, in contrast with the general grossness of the age, it did not aspire to the highest motives, as these were felt in the early days of Christianity, and as they are again apprehended in modern times. Notwithstanding the vow of devotion, there was little that was altruistic about it. The thought of the devotee was ultimately upon himself, his renown and glory, his crested helmet, his gilded spurs, his horse in housing of gold, and the scarlet silk which marked him as apart from and above his fellows, were not promotive of that humility and self-forgetfulness from which all great moral actions spring. Our modern characterization of the proud man is borrowed from the knight's leaving his palfrey and mounting his charger, or, as it was called, getting on his high horse. In battle, the personality of the knight was not, as in the case of the modern soldier, merged in the autonomy of the brigade or squadron. He appeared singly against a selected antagonist of equal rank with his own, so that the field presented the appearance of a multitude of private combats. In the lull of regular warfare, he sought solitary adventures for gaining renown, and often challenged his companions in arms to contest with him the palm of greater glory. Western writers aptly likened the medieval knights to the heroic chiefs of Arabia, and even of the American Indians, to whom personal prowess is more than patriotism. Hallam would choose as the finest representative of the chivalric spirit the Greek Achilles, who could fight valiantly or sulk in his tent regardless of the cause, when his individual honor or right seemed to be menaced. The association of chivalry with gallantry, though prompted by the benevolent motive of helping the weak or paying homage to woman as the embodiment of the pure and beautiful, did not always serve these high purposes. The love of God and the ladies, enjoined as a single duty, was often to the detriment of the religious part of the obligation. The fair one who was championed in the tournament was apt to be sought beyond the list. The poetry of the troubadours shows how the purest and most delicate sentiment next to the religious, the love of man for woman, became debauched by a custom which flaunted amid the brutal scenes of the combat the name of her whose glory is her modesty, and often made her virtue the prize of the ring. Doubtless the good knight felt that the altar of his consecration was not high enough. Even his vow to defend the faith had, within the bounds of Christendom, little field where it would be honoured by exploit of arms, to take his part in the miserable quarrels that were chronic between rival popes, or in the wars of the imperial against the prelatic powers. Both professedly Christian, could not satisfy any really religious desires he may have felt. The chivalric spirit thus kindled the aspiration for an ideal which it could not furnish. If the soldier of the cross must wear armour, he would find no satisfaction unless he sheathed his sword in the flesh of the infidels, whose hordes were gathering beyond the borders of Christendom. The institution of chivalry thus prepared the way for the crusades, which afforded a field for all its physical heroism, while at the same time these great movements stimulated and gratified what to this superstitious age was the deepest religious impulse.